You can look at pictures, but you can, I don't know. Something is. It's a number, right? It's still smart.
Hi, Amber, Jamie, and Kelly. Hi, everybody here in the room. All right.
Good morning, Dr. Earl.
How you doing, Amber?
Good, thank you.
It's early for you there. Well, not too bad, right? 9 o'clock.
Yeah, no, not that bad. Not like 5 o'clock.
Yeah. Guys, I'm ready to answer your questions. Yes, Jamaica.
When you were filling out that chart in class. with the
Yes.
IE and
Yes.
the LE, you said don't memorize this chart, you understand that there are whatever equations you can
Yeah.
do based off of that.
Yeah.
What are those equations?
The equations are, okay, so let's say we're given a problem where we say that a patient is on a low extraction drug cleared by the liver. Now, I may or may not be that overt about telling you that. You might have to figure that out from the information that I give you. Do you feel comfortable figuring out if it's a low or high extraction drug?
Give us an example. No.
Okay, so here's where I'm gonna start. And I don't know, can you guys see me over here?
We can see you. It's a little hard to hear just because it's so echoey. But also, while you're on this question, can you do the different examples of how to calculate low or high E?
Sure. But I have to figure out how to make this so you can see me. Thanks. Now.
Oh, we can see you.
You're seeing my butt, but I want you to be able to see this. This board.
We can kind of see it. If you start writing on it, I'll tell you if it. We could. Yeah, there we go. That might
Okay,
be-
maybe that'll work if I turn it like this.
Yeah, probably.
I don't know why I didn't bring the stupid thing. Okay, so. I'm gonna just do a little general overview first and then we'll jump in, okay? So when we talk about clearance of a drug. We know how important it is because it affects both CSS average and half-life. Is it gonna affect how we might adjust both our dose rate and our dose interval, right? Everybody's good with that, right? So when we start talking about clearance, the first thing that I bring two that don't work. Okay, the first thing we're gonna wanna figure out is what is the organ of clearance that we're really talking about here? Or are we talking about both? Right, so how do we determine what organ of clearance we're really talking about? What will tell you that? I could just say it's totally cleared by the liver, it's totally cleared by the kidneys, right? What else might I tell you?
The FE?
Right, percent of the organ or the FE. And the FE is a fraction of drug excreted unchanged in the urine. You can't see that, can you? I don't know, I can't hardly see.
No.
Which is the, really is the percentage of renal clearance. Okay, so if the FE is 0, what are we assuming the clearance is? It's hepatic, isn't it? If the FE is 1, what then? Then it's renal, isn't it? I'm gonna try to turn off these lights here. That's a little too. I can't do back and front, can I? Does that take some of the shine off so you can see it? Not really. Do I need a darker marker? Do you have a black one I can borrow? All right, so. Once we know that it's hepatic in this case. Right, the next thing we want to ask, is it high or low? Right, extraction ratio. So how do we determine that? I could tell you, I could say E is 0.017, or I could tell you it's 0.83, or I could ask you, thank you, Livia, to calculate the E. And the things I could do is give you total, I can give you total clearance, or I can give you the hepatic clearance. And either way, as long as you have the FE, you will be able to determine the hepatic clearance, right? And what we know is that hepatic clearance is equal to hepatic blood flow times our extraction efficiency from the liver. Q times E, right? We all know that, right? So if we know our hepatic clearance and we assume a normal Q, which I've given to you in your equation sheet, and you all know is
9.
90 liters per hour, or make sure you get the units right, or 1.5 liters per minute, depending on what you need. So you put that in as a known value, and you can solve for E. And then depending on if it's approaching 0 or approaching 1, you're gonna call it either a low or high E drug respectively, right? Right, Sophia? Yes, she agrees with you.
Wait, so which one is it? What's approaching one is higher one? High?
Yeah,
Okay,
because it's between 0 and 1, right? Olivia?
yes.
So if it's between 0 and 1, it says approaching 1. It's high, it says approaching 0, it's low.
Dr. Earl,
Yeah,
are you gonna make it pretty obvious if it's high or low? Like it won't be close to 0.6 or something?
right, I won't put it in the middle.
Okay, and then you said.
Because in the middle, we can't really make assumptions.
Right, and then you said, you would give us the CL and then we would know the Q, and that's how we would get the E value?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So, because we know we can never have any organ clearance that surpasses the blood flow to the organ, right? It's never gonna be faster than that,
Right,
right? It's gonna be limited by blood flow always. That's with an E of 100%. All right? Because if our E is 1, then the fastest it can be is Q. Once we know that, if it's a high E, we know that clearance is approximated by Q, and we have to worry about the first pass effect, don't we? Uh-oh. Amber alert. And Westchester, I don't know where that is. You know where that is?
Cincinnati area.
We can't go out and look for the child, I guess, at this point, so. All right, so the first pass effect is gonna be approximated by Q over intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound. But these are almost always non-restrictively cleared drugs, and what does non-restrictive mean?
Is that high?
Yeah, that's high E. That means that fraction unbound is seen like 1 because the liver enzymes see it all as being free, don't they? So they see it as 1. And if it's a low E drug, what do we know? What is clearance approximated by for a low E drug for hepatic low extraction drugs? Pardon me? Intrinsic clearance and FU, which is what everybody likes about this class, because you get to say FU a lot. But we don't mean it. Intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound for a low E drug. And what about the first pass effect? Do we have to worry about the first pass effect for a low E drug? No, because it's approximated by 1. Most all of the drug gets through the liver without being metabolized if it's a low E drug, right? You good? So getting back to our original question. If we have, I say we have a patient that's on a drug that has an FE of 0 and has a total body clearance of 10 liters per hour. And and it's cleared by 2D6. And they've been given another drug that causes 2D6 induction. So they've had an induction of 2D6. How will you have to change that patient's dosing regimen? Yeah, Ben.
2D6 is an enzyme that breaks it down.
Enzyme inducer, so another drug is given that induces 2D6, and let's say this drug is cleared by 2D6. Pardon me? Okay, we may, right, so let's think through all the steps, okay? So we had an induction of 2D6, so what does that mean? That means that the intrinsic clearance is increased, right? Could everybody have gotten that out of that? Guys online, would you, if I said you're given another drug that induced 2D6, would you be able to think, okay, that's an increase in intrinsic clearance?
Probably because of it
Yeah.
being, it sounds like an enzyme, right? So
Yep, it's like
probably-
2D6 is one of the CYP enzymes, that's right. Okay, so what's happened here is an increase in intrinsic clearance. Now, what kind of drug is it? We know it's cleared by the liver because FE is 0. Is it gonna be a high or low extraction drug? Low, how did you know that? Because 10 divided by 90 is a small number, that's right, we don't really even need to do the math, do we, for this? It's a low extraction drug. So what we know, if it's a low extraction drug, we know clearance is determined by intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound. And the first pass, the fraction that escapes the first pass is 100%. Okay, so what are you gonna do next? You're gonna say, okay, do I wanna make a change in dosing regimen? What do I wanna ask myself? Do I wanna change my dose rate? How do I decide? Chamaka, how do you decide? You wanna change the dose rate?
What, that's CSS?
Very good. What's happened to CSS average? So CSS average, we know, I haven't been told if this is oral or IV. You look to determine that whether or not you need to consider bioavailability, right? And it's gonna be bioavailable dose rate all over clearance. Now that's total concentration at steady state. Do I need to consider what's happening with free? I mean, that's what we really wanna know. But do I have to go to the trouble of figuring out what's happening to free concentration in this case?
No,
Sophia says no. And I don't know if that was Jamie or Kelly. One of you guys said no. You're right. Why not? When's the only time we really have to look at actually looking at the free concentration equation to determine what happens with free? When there's a binding change, right? Because the only difference between the total and free concentration equations is what? Well, we all like to say it's an FU, isn't it? So as long as the FU stays the same, we don't have to consider really, we know whatever's happening with total is gonna be what's happening with free. Okay,
Dr.
Olivia? Yeah,
Dr. Earl, like if we know there's a binding change, will it be explicit, like whether there's an increase or decrease in like AAG? Is that how we'll know there's a binding change? Or
I'd
is there
say there's an increase or decrease in AAG. I'd say there's a displacement interaction.
Okay,
I'd
display-
say there's a decrease in albumin. Yeah, I'll be explicit. Okay? So we're gonna stick with this. We don't know if bioavailability is an issue, but we know what determines bioavailability is the fraction absorbed times the fraction that escapes the gut times the fraction that escapes the liver, which is, we're assuming 100% or thereabouts because it's a low E drug. And clearance is gonna be determined by enzyme activity and binding. And what's happened here? We have an increase in intrinsic clearance, so what's gonna happen to our CSS average? It's gonna decrease because our clearance has increased, hasn't it? So yes, you're right, we're gonna wanna increase our dose rate, right? Is everybody good with that? How about dose interval? Well, I'm gonna take a look at half-life, 0.693, volume over clearance. Again, for this drug, clearance is approximated by enzyme activity and binding. And what determines volume? Fraction amount in plasma over fraction amount in tissue, right? So what's happened again here? This is increased, therefore half-life is gonna get shorter, it's gonna be eliminated more quickly because our clearance is increased. Right? And therefore, we're gonna decrease our dosing interval, give it more often. So we're gonna increase our dose rate and decrease our dosing interval for tau. So I will ask you questions like this. And how you can use that chart, Shamaka, is to ask your, it's a built-in a bunch of questions. That you can test yourself. You poke one of those squares and it says. Like this one, increase in intrinsic clearance for a low extraction drug. What am I gonna do with dose rate and dose interval?
Okay. Wait, those interval?
In this case, we're gonna increase dose rate and decrease dose interval, but it just depends on what the situation is, doesn't it? So you're gonna use this to anticipate drug and disease interactions, so your patient doesn't have to have, in this case, their concentration fall. And therefore possibly suffer from lack of efficacy. Right? Yeah,
Could you possibly do one where we look at the when times the binding change?
sure. You wanna do low extraction or high extraction or both? Okay, let's do low extraction, so let's say it's the same situation. But instead of there being a drug added that induces 2D6. Now, first of all, it would have to be a highly bound drug, so I would have to say, let's say the fraction unbound is 0.05, okay? And so it's highly protein bound to the plasma. And we have another drug that comes along and displaces, and let's say it's to albumin, displaces the our drug from the albumin binding site. So if I say that, what are you picturing? You're picturing another drug coming along and bumping your original drug off of the plasma protein binding site, and now that drug is free. Right? So there's an increase in your free fraction. Not necessarily concentration, we'll get to that in a minute. Your free fraction. Did you have your hand raised, Shamaka? Are you good? Okay, so if that's the case, again, let's see. Do we need to now look at free concentration? To determine what's happening with free concentration? Ben says yes. Why? Because there's a binding change, so we can't trust total. But I'm gonna figure out what's happening with total as well, because that's what you're gonna see back from the lab, and you want to be able to anticipate that. So let's do both total and free. So here's our total concentration. It's gonna be F times dose rate all over clearance. If we're giving it orally, we have to worry about changes in FA, changes in FG, changes in FH, but remember FH is approximated by 1 for this low extraction drug. And clearance is approximated by intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound, right? So if there's an increase in our fraction unbound because it's been displaced, what's gonna happen to our clearance? It's gonna go up, because more, remember, only free drug can be cleared for this kind of drug. So it's gonna, our clearance is gonna increase, because more drug is available for clearance. Right? So our total concentration is going down. But what about our free concentration? Well, it's gonna be F bioavailable dose rate over clearance. This whole thing times fraction unbound to get free concentration, right? So again, F is determined by FA times FG times FH, which for this high extraction drug is approximated by 1. And clearance is approximated by enzyme activity times binding fraction unbound, right? And what's happened here? We've had this displacement, so we've got an increase in fraction unbound, which we know increases our clearance, we already determined that. But the drug has been released from its protein out in the periphery, right, in your plasma. And so yes, what you'll see originally is your free concentration will go up. But what happens as soon as it gets to the liver? It's now also available to be cleared when it wasn't before. So it will be cleared, and at steady state, no change. Because these will offset each other. Okay? Does that make sense? You're all furiously writing. You guys okay out in cyberspace?
Yes.
Sorry, you can't see. Anyway, okay. So we would not want to change the dose rate in this case, right? Even though what's going to come back from the lab is going to be lower. But what we want to do with our free concentration, which is the pharmacologically active form, is we want to leave it alone. Which part?
So we're not changing the dose rate.
We don't want to change the dose rate. Why? What do we care about really, Jamaka? The free one, right? Because that's the pharmacologically active form. And that's not going to change at steady state, is it? So do we want to give more drug? No, we want to leave it.
And how do we know it's at steady state?
Well, we're gonna assume they're gonna get to steady state because we're gonna keep giving it to them. This is something we're gonna keep giving, you know? So originally, you won't see it even out until steady state, which is 5 half-lives, right?
Dr. Earl,
Yeah,
this is kind of random, but so like for CSS total and CSS free, so we
Yeah.
look at CSS free when there's a binding change. Like if we were to look at that and there wasn't a binding change, would that be incorrect? Or is it just
Not
extra work
incorrect.
you don't need to
No,
do?
it just won't be any different than the total, right?
Okay.
Because the only time these two are gonna be different is when there's a binding change.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I'm
Thank you.
just trying to save you a step.
Right. Thank you.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay, what about half-life? Well, again, in this case, we already know that there's going to be an increase in clearance due to this increase in fraction unbound, right? But that increase in fraction unbound also increases volume, doesn't it? To the same extent. So again, at steady state, there'll be no change in half-life because both volume and clearance increase to the same extent. Isn't that interesting? So do we want to make any change at all in our dose rate? Or our dose, I should say in our dose interval? Or no, what I mean is our dosing regimen. Do we want to change our dosing regimen? No, we're not changing dose rate or dose interval, are we? Crazy. Is nothing happening? No, a lot's happening. Our clearance is increasing. Yeah. Our clearance is increasing. Our volume is increasing, right? But we have these opposing factors that come out, and there's no change in free concentration and no change in half-life. So we leave it alone. We're gonna want to increase the dose rate because the total concentration is gonna come back lower from the lab, isn't it? Tricky. All right, so that's for a low extraction drug. What if we have this binding change for a high extraction drug? Do you want to give it IV or PO? And they must have put new boards in here. These boards are so nice. Let's do IV because it's easier and then we'll do PO, okay? All right, so what we've got is this displacement from the albumin binding site, which means an increase in fraction unbound. Just as a fun idea, what if this drug was stopped? That we know displaces it. It would be the opposite, right? So make sure if I ask you when something stopped, that doesn't befuddle you. It's just the opposite of what would have happened when it was added, right? You good with that, Olivia? All right, so if it's stopped, don't let it fluster you, just, it's the opposite. So in this case, again, it's still an increase in fraction unbound, but now we have a low extraction drug. So let's say the clearance was 75 liters per hour, just for grins. So we now know it's a high extraction drug, right? And then clearance is going to be approximated by Q, and FH is approximated by Q over intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound, which turns into a 1 because it's what the liver sees it all as being free if it's non-restrictively cleared. It's all fair game. Okay. So now let's apply our, do we want to make a change in dose rate? Well, do we need to look at free? Yes, we need to look at total and free. Why? Because there's a binding change. So let's look at total first, and we're gonna give it IV, so we don't have to worry about bioavailability. So we just have dose rate over clearance for this drug is Q, right? So it's dose rate divided by Q. Is total likely to change in this case when there's a binding change? No. Not gonna change. Why? Because binding isn't an issue, free drug is not an issue when it's a high extraction drug. It's all about getting the blood to the liver, isn't it? Now, as we said, what we really need to know though is free concentration. And so free concentration is going to be dose rate over clearance, which for this high extraction drug is Q, times fraction unbound. So in this case, again, if you think about what's happening in the blood, our drug is bounced off of its plasma protein binding site, and now it's free, which happened in both cases. But what isn't happening this time? When it gets to the liver, is it now gonna be cleared when it wasn't before? No, it was still gonna be cleared then, so there's no difference in clearance. So when the fraction unbound goes up, your free concentration will go up. Pretty tricky. So if that free concentration goes up, we're gonna need to do what? Decrease dose rate, right? You good with that, Shamaka? All right, how about half-life? You guys okay online?
Yeah.
Okay, half-life is gonna be 0.693 volume over clearance. And again, for this high extraction drug, clearance is approximated by Q. Volume of distribution is really about your fraction unbound in plasma over your fraction unbound in tissue. And what's happened here? Your fraction unbound in plasma has increased, therefore your volume has increased. No change in your clearance. What's going to happen to half-life? It's going to get longer because your volume is larger. Yeah.
So for volume, is it just like that fraction is the volume and they're just next to each other, or
Well, remember what I've done is I've simplified that VSS is equal to VP plus VT fraction of bounded plasma over fraction of bounded tissue, right? Do you remember this equation? And I do give you this equation, but what we do is we kind of shorten it down to this, simplify it down to this. Is that good, Haley? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Can you do that because BP is gonna be constant?
Yeah, it's pretty constant. And if it isn't, you don't have to worry about drug interactions because you're probably bleeding out and that's that. Not to
Dr.
make it horrific, but that's really true. Yeah.
On like T half-life, if there
Yeah.
is a binding change, we don't add FUP on the end, right? Like we do with CSS.
No, because half-life really doesn't. There's not free and total half-lives. Half-life is half-life, it's just volume and clearance, and it's total body clearance.
Okay, so the only thing that
Does that
changes.
make sense?
The denominator is the only thing that changes, depending on whether it's high or low.
For the half-life, yep.
Okay, cool, thank
And you
you.
don't have to worry about root dependence or anything like that, or free and total. It's straight up volume and clearance. Does that help simplify?
Yeah, it does, thank you.
Sure. So in this case, we're gonna want a decreased dose rate, increased dose interval, if it were given IV. Now, PO gets a little trickier, doesn't it? Well, our half-life isn't gonna change, doesn't matter whether it's given IV or PO for half-life, does it? But for CSS total concept, CSS total, we have to consider bioavailability, which is FA times FG times FH, which is Q over intrinsic clearance, times that weird fraction of bound that's seen as 1 because it's non-restrictively cleared, all over clearance, which is approximated by Q. Now, just as an aside, if I had this situation and we don't have it displaced from the plasma protein binding site, but let's say there's a change in FG. Do we care then if that's still gonna matter here, isn't it? If there's a change in FG. So don't forget about FG and FA. They're still part of bioavailability, even though we're focused on FH, because that's physiologically related to hepatic clearance, isn't it? They're intertwined, aren't they? Okay, so back to this problem. Do we think that there's gonna be a change in our total concentration at steady state if there's an increase in fraction of bound? No, Sophia's right. No, we're not gonna see any change, are we? What about free concentration? We have to write this whole thing out again. This fraction of bound becomes 1 because it's non-restrictively cleared times dose rate all over Q times fraction on bound. Again, this is going to, fraction on bound is going to increase, and we'll see an increase in our free concentration, but not our total if we give it oral.
Is that for low or high E?
No, just high E given orally.
Okay, because I was a little confused in the slides when it gives the equation for like CSS total and CSS free. It's like, because there's no route dependence for low E, so I figured the FA, FG, FH like wouldn't matter because they'd be basically one.
Right.
So I was confused why it was in the equation, but would we just omit those since it would just be considered one?
Yes, this Q over intrinsic clearance for a low E would be considered 1. Is
Okay.
that what you mean?
Well,
For a,
kind of. So it gives like, say, like for example, the PO CSS total equation on the slide.
Yeah.
It says like S times FA times FG times 1 for the FH times dose rate over CL intrinsic times FU. So
Yep.
should we keep the FA and FG in there for PO, or does it not matter because it's
sure,
low?
it always matters. Yeah, FA and FG will always matter.
Okay, so even for
If
low
it's
E.
given orally, if it's given orally, it's always part of the bioavailability piece.
Okay,
Thank you for clarifying that. So in this case, our free concentration is gonna go up, we're gonna decrease dose rate, and we're gonna increase half-life. Or increase dose interval, sorry. You like it, Shamaka?
This is like not regarding that, but like,
Yeah.
there's no video uploaded for the hepatic quiz. And
There's not? I'll make sure it's uploaded, thought I did.
Okay, thank you.
I apologize. Yeah, no, dude, fix it. No questions about renal? You're good on renal. I think hepatic is harder, but some people think renal's harder, I don't know. So if we look back at our big picture, when we look at renal. We really, once we know that it's renally cleared, we wanna know what's the predominant process, secretion or reabsorption, right? Why do we wanna know that? Because we're trying to figure out what drug and disease interactions we might see, right? So if it's predominantly secreted. What are we gonna be looking for? And if it's predominantly reabsorbed? What are we gonna be looking for? What's the difference? How do we tell whether something's predominantly secreted or predominantly reabsorbed? Says? Huh? We compare what's coming into the tubule, which is our glomerular filtration clearance, which I can't happen to say. So that's when the drug first enters the nephron, right? Is with glomerular filtration clearance. And then what goes out is gonna be our renal clearance, right? So we know what happens in between here is drug is added by secretion, active secretion, and then there's drug reabsorbed, which is a passive diffusion situation, right? So if more is coming in that goes out, so if filtration clearance is greater than your renal clearance, what must be happening? What's gonna be the predominant process? If more is coming into the tubule and less is going out, it's gotta be reabsorbed, right? It's gotta be taken back into the blood. So reabsorption is gonna be glomerular filtration clearance greater than renal clearance. And you shouldn't have to memorize this, you should be able to understand it. I don't know about you, but I hate memorizing. I'd rather understand it, which is why I kind of want you guys to too. Cause then you know it forever, you don't have to think, oh, which way does that arrow go? And you know, cause you don't really understand it, you're just memorizing. If you understand it, then it's yours. So what if the amount going out, the renal clearance is higher than your glomerular filtration clearance? What if more is going out than came in through filtration? Then the predominant process must be
Active secretion.
active secretion. Why? Because
more-
drug is being added, isn't it?
Mhm.
So then it has to be active secretion. Okay, so this one's gonna be where our glomerular filtration clearance is less than our renal clearance, okay? Then once you know that, to me, the key is just thinking, what's happening then? Active secretion, if it's predominantly actively secreted, what's going on? The drug is being moved against a concentration gradient from the blood into the urine. So I think of little scoops moving from the blood, taking drug from the blood, flopping it over into the urine. The biggest thing we worry about that is for competition for those little shovels or little scoops. It's really transport systems, which sounds much more official, but I pictured little scooping drug from the blood into the urine. And there's a fixed number, right? It's a Michaelis-Menten situation. There's a fixed number of these transport sites. And so there's competition for those transport sites. And so if you have a drug that's an acid that needs a ride into the penicillin, because I'm thinking of penicillin, into the urine, it's gonna be competing with other acids that are predominantly actively secreted. But it's only gonna be competing with other acids, it won't compete with bases. Acids will compete with acids and bases will compete with bases. When one of those competitor drugs is added or taken away, you have to try to figure out which one is the preferred drug and how do you do that? Their relative affinity constants, in this case, it's KTS, right? Whichever one has the lower KTS is gonna be the preferred drug to get that ride over into the urine. So maybe it'll interfere and maybe it won't. Yeah.
For the affinity, what did you say about that one more time?
That the lower KTS is gonna be the preferred agent, right? So you have to compare the KTSs.
I thought it was KD.
KD is for binding, but it's the same idea, Shamaka, because it's Michaelis-Menten over and over and over again, whichever one has the lowest affinity. The lower concentration where half of whatever is occupied is gonna be the higher affinity drug, right?
What's TS do?
Tubular secretion. Victoria's question was, what does TS stand for? So KTS is that affinity constant for those tubular secretion sites that they are competing for, right? So the lower KTS will be the preferred agent to get the ride, so you can then figure out what's gonna happen if that is added or subtracted, right? If it's got a higher KTS, nothing's gonna happen. Because it's not the preferred agent. Okay? So basically that's what you need to know about secretion. Now, what about reabsorption? Reabsorption is not an active process, you don't need a ride. What do you need in order for the drug to be reabsorbed?
Concentration gradient.
Yep, needs to have a concentration gradient because that's what powers it. So if you ruin the concentration gradient by giving a diuretic, or you stop a diuretic and you enhance the concentration gradient, you're gonna see a difference in the reabsorption, right? Will that affect secretion? No, but it will affect reabsorption. Right? You good? What else? So for a drug to undergo passive diffusion, there has to be a concentration gradient driving it. What else do you need? You need the drug to be unionized, small enough, right? And lipophilic enough. How can we change any of those? We can easily change the ionic character by doing what?
Change pH.
Changing the pH of the urine, right? Changing the pH of the urine is going to change the ionic character because we know this from chemistry. Henderson-Hasselbalch, did you learn that in chemistry 101? I don't remember. So you learn about Henderson-Hasselbalch. So if you change the pH, you've changed the amount of protons around, right? To ionize or unionize whatever drugs are in there. So if you favor the unionized species, that's gonna then favor reabsorption. Right, which will actually decrease renal clearance, won't it? You follow me on that? If you block reabsorption, that's because the drug has moved to more of the ionized form. Because of a pH change. So when you see pH changes and adding or subtracting a diuretic, those are really the things that are gonna affect reabsorption. That I'm gonna ask. Because those are the only things that we can change really with drug interactions and disease interactions. Does that help simplify? So if you see a pH change or adding or subtracting of a diuretic, you're looking for reabsorbed drugs. If you see another drug that's primarily secreted that's added, then you're looking for other secreted drugs. I'm sorry, what were you saying? I just wanted to finish that thought before I forgot. Okay.
So you said that the unionized form favors reabsorption, which will decrease clearance, because
Correct.
it goes back to the blood.
Correct.
Will drug ever become unionized in the blood and not be able to, or are we just worried about it in the tubule?
Well, it does change a little bit in the blood, but remember, there's not big pH changes in the blood because you
Right.
die then.
Okay, so we're just worried about it in the tubule if it's unionized.
Yeah, the
Thank you.
pH of the urine is much more volatile than pH of the blood because there's a really robust buffer system in the blood so that you can continue to live no matter the
So
circumstance.
can you do an example like where if you alkalinize the urine, what happens, and like how you use Henderson Hasselbalch with the I over U and then the increase of pH? We do that.
So we're gonna alkalinize the urine?
Yeah.
So first of all, we have to be talking about a drug that's reabsorbed. Right, so we're talking about a drug that's reabsorbed, you all know how to figure that out. So if we alkalinize the urine. Okay, we wanna know, do you wanna ask like which of these drugs, let's say we'll have, sometimes I ask, we'll have an increase in CSS average. Or a decrease in CSS average. So if we say it's an increase in CSS average, then that means we would have had to see a decrease in clearance, right? So what's gonna favor a decrease in clearance? Blocking or enhancing reabsorption? Enhancing, thank you, Chamaka. So we're gonna have enhancing the reabsorption. So we're looking for a drug that's in the unionized form, right? Everybody with me? The unionized, then more of it's gonna be moving back into the blood, decreasing the clearance, increasing CSS. I could have switched it around, right? But I wanted to ask it in a more complex way because I always hated it when teachers gave really simple examples and then gave a hard example on example, right? So think through this. So we're looking for more unionized forms. So if we have another drug that's reabsorbed, and let's say it's an acid, right? Remember my silly way of remembering it, an acid, they're kind of mean guys. They put I over U, they put themselves over U, so ionized over unionized. So if we're in a alkalinization, we're increasing the pH, yes? So if we increase the pH, then you think I am favoring the numerator here, which is an I. So a reabsorbed weak acid in alkalinized urine, if you increase the pH, is going to be more in the ionized form, which means it's going to enhance the reabsorption. I'm sorry, block the reabsorption. So it won't get reabsorbed because it's got a charge. It's going to stay in the urine. So we're going to see an increase in clearance and a decrease in CSS. So that's not what we're looking for. Our answer won't be another drug that's reabsorbed that's an acid. Can you see with this here? All right. What about a base? A base is the opposite. They're basically nice guys. They are polite and they put U over I. So if you put U over I, and we're favoring that numerator because we're increasing the pH. It's unionized. If it's more in the unionized form, it's gonna get reabsorbed. Right? The renal clearance is gonna go down and CSS average is gonna go up. And that's what we're looking for. So we're looking for a reabsorbed base. And that's when we'll see alkalinization of the urine. Decreasing renal clearance and increasing the CSS average of the drug. What would it do to half-life? Same thing, decrease in clearance and increase in half-life, yes? You go with that, Haley? Or am I talking too fast?
You lost me on the half-life part.
Okay, so half-life, remember, is just volume over clearance. So if we, in this case, increase the clearance because we're, decrease the clearance, we're decreasing the clearance because it's staying in the urine. No, what are we doing? Now I've screwed it up myself. Okay, no, we're more in the unionized form, so we're enhancing clearance. No, stop, wait, time out. See, it's easy to get turned around, so take your time. Unionized form, it's gonna favor reabsorption. Favoring reabsorption decreases renal clearance. So that decreases clearance, so what will happen to our half-life?
It should increase.
Thank you, someone around here knows what's going on, yes, it'll increase half-life, yeah?
So I thought, okay, so this is.
Go ahead.
Sorry, don't know if you may,
Oh.
so like, I thought K was. So on this clearance stuff, like T half-life and K seem to be. Like the equations are a little like different, I guess, like, cause I was surprised, like when we were doing hepatic or, and how it was over. Didn't it used to be over K, like 0.693 over K was
Yeah.
half.
But what we take that one more step, because K doesn't really tell us too much physiologically.
Oh.
We have to then say that K is clearance over volume.
Which it is, okay, yeah.
So
Ah,
that, it's the same equation, it's just taking it out one more step, Kelly.
makes sense, actually it does. And then we said T half-life is really volume over clearance?
Yep.
Okay,
0.693 volume over clearance, yep,
okay.
yeah,
Thank
Ben. Mm-hmm.
Based on the facts that this drug was being reabsorbed, you knew that unionized was immediately favored, and then you moved on to the next part? Or did you have to do something to figure out unionized was favored?
I had to do something to figure out the unionized was favored. I had to look at my Henderson Hasselbalch and say if it's a weak base and you have a higher pH, there's fewer protons available, so it's gonna be more unionized and therefore favoring reabsorption.
Right, but how are you making that last statement?
Which
How are
one?
you deciding that because it's unionized, it's enhancing reabsorption?
Because what state does it, or did you wanna answer that, Haley? That'd be great.
I think it's just because it has to get through like the membranes, and it's gotta be, not ionized to do that.
Yeah, remember with passive diffusion, it doesn't let anything with a charge through. So it has to be unionized in order to actually pass through the membrane between the nephron and the blood.
So then I guess my question is, if we were trying to enhance secretion, we want the ionized in this situation?
Not enhancing secretion, you mean enhancing reabsorption?
Well, no, I thought you just said enhancing reabsorption, we want the unionized version.
Correct.
So if you're increasing,
Secretion has nothing to do with charge, right? It's just about getting that ride into the urine.
okay. So then the value CLGF
Yes,
is clearance or filtration.
yes. So it's GFR times free fraction.
So if you're having more clearance in the filtration tube,
So if this increases that filtration coming in. Which can't happen if you have increase in free fraction or a change in GFR. Are they waiting to come in? We can finish up talking about this, Ben, if you want to. Are you guys good? You guys online good? Send me any questions that you want. If you put them on the discussion board, it might make it easier for me to answer for lots of people. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Bye.